So I was playing Sifu recently, and I had this moment where I thought, wow, the defense mechanics in this game aren't just about timing my dodges correctly, I also have to choose the correct direction when dodging. And something about that extra layer of defense, having to think about more than just raw timing, it felt strange to me. Not in a bad way, but in a way that made me stop and think. Because it felt different from how defense mechanics work in most modern action games. In a lot of action games today, defense mechanics have gotten much more simple. Usually, you press a button, you get a few invincibility frames, and if you time it right, you're safe. Whether it's a parry or a dodge, the interaction is often the same. Timing matters, but extra layers like direction almost never do. And don't get me wrong, I enjoy these types of defense mechanics. They're accessible, they feel satisfying, and they can still be challenging in a fun way. But once I noticed how a core part of Sifu's defense system made me care about extra layers like the direction of enemy attacks, instead of just focusing on raw timing, it made me realize how rare that kind of design has become. And all of that made me wonder, have modern action games simplified defense mechanics so much that they've actually become less engaging? And to understand why this feeling is so noticeable, we need to take a closer look at how defense mechanics actually function in modern action games, and why so many of them end up feeling almost identical. So the first game I want to look at is one of the most popular action games of all time, Elden Ring. Elden Ring's defense mechanics are very much built around raw timing rather than extra layers like direction. When you tap the dodge button while moving in any direction, you roll, and depending on your equipment load, you get roughly half a second of invincibility where you simply cannot be hit. And for the vast majority of attacks in this game, the direction you roll doesn't really matter. As long as you press the button at the right time, you're completely safe. Even the game's other defensive options, like parrying, follow this same philosophy. Success is almost entirely determined by timing, not positioning or directional awareness. Because of this, Elden Ring becomes a perfect example of how modern action games prioritize timing-based defense above everything else. This same timing-based philosophy applies to other Soulsborne games like Dark Souls 3 and Bloodborne. But what about a Soulsborne game that focuses on deflecting instead of dodging? That brings me to Sekiro. Unlike Elden Ring, Sekiro goes all in on its parry mechanic, but much like Elden Ring, this parry system is still built almost entirely around raw timing. If you press the button at the right moment, you deflect the attack and take no damage. Parrying is the core defensive mechanic of this game, so this timing-based interaction applies to the majority of enemy attacks. Sekiro also includes a dodge mechanic, but that too is timing-based, complete with invincibility frames. And while Sekiro does introduce a form of directional defense through the Makiri counter, this mechanic only applies to a very specific category of attacks. Because of that, it feels more like an exception rather than a core pillar of the game's defense design. So once again, we see a modern action game that overwhelmingly prioritizes raw timing over any additional defensive layers. But Sekiro didn't just refine timing-based defense, I think it helped make it the standard. Once its combat proved how satisfying this approach to defense could be, the industry followed. Lies of P, the Star Wars Jedi series, Marvel's Spider-Man 2, Clair Obscur, the first Berserker Kazan. Over and over again, the defense mechanics of modern action games rely on the same core idea. Press the button at the right time, and you are safe. And when something like that becomes standardized, it's worth asking an important question. What might we be giving up in return? To understand that trade-off, we need to look at a completely different approach to defense. One where timing alone isn't enough, and extra layers like direction and positioning actually matter. This is where multi-layered defense mechanics come in. The first game I want to talk about here puts a heavy emphasis on positioning as a core defensive layer. Hollow Knight Silksong. In Silksong, positioning and the direction that enemy attacks come from are incredibly important. Not only are attacks fast and reaction heavy, but you constantly have to think about where you're standing and where you're about to move. Defending yourself isn't just about timing your button press at the right time. It's about choosing the correct space to occupy in the middle of chaotic encounters. And having to think about these extra layers dramatically increases the intensity of each fight. Because of that, Silksong becomes a great example of how multi-layered defense mechanics can make combat feel more engaging and dynamic. The second game I want to talk about puts a heavy emphasis on the direction of enemy attacks, Sifu. As I mentioned earlier, I was genuinely surprised at how much direction mattered here. In Sifu, enemies can attack both high and low. To avoid these attacks, you not only need good timing, but you also need to dodge in the correct direction. If an enemy attacks high, you need to dodge low. If they attack low, you need to dodge high. And if you choose the wrong direction, you will get hit, even if your timing was perfect. This single change adds a massive extra layer to the game's defense system. And because of this, Sifu becomes another strong example of how multi-layered defense mechanics can dramatically increase engagement. When you compare these systems to the timing-based defense found in most modern action games, it becomes clear that these added layers do something important. They fundamentally change how combat feels. Multi-layered defense mechanics force players to make quicker and more thoughtful decisions under pressure. Instead of thinking one-dimensionally about raw timing, players begin thinking multi-dimensionally about timing, positioning, and directional awareness all at once. Questions like, where should I stand next time? Or, which direction should I dodge? Suddenly become a part of every interaction, and having to answer those questions in real time adds intensity, tension, and depth to the combat. Another reason why multi-layered defense mechanics feel more engaging is because they prevent what I like to call autopilot play. In many timing-based systems, you learn the rhythm of enemy attacks, and defense becomes muscle memory. You press the same buttons in the same way over and over again, and combat slowly becomes a routine. Multi-layered defense mechanics break that pattern. They force constant adaptation, preventing players from switching their brains off. And because of that, each encounter feels more unique, more thoughtful, and more impactful. All of this leads me to believe that when action games simplify defense mechanics down to raw timing alone, they lose a massive amount of their potential depth. And while accessibility is important, trading away these layers ultimately makes combat less engaging. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that modern action games completely ignore multi-layered defense mechanics. Even some of the games I use as examples of simplified systems occasionally include these layers. For instance, Knight Artorias in Elden Ring Night Rain has a triple slam attack that you can't simply dodge through with invincibility frames. You actually have to move out of the way of the hitbox by choosing the correct direction. That's really cool, but it's also rare. This is one attack out of his entire moveset. Almost everything else can still be solved with a simple timing-based dodge. And that's the key point here. These mechanics exist, but they are not prioritized. They're the exception, but not the rule. So to answer the main question of this video, yes, I think modern action games simplifying their defense mechanics do ultimately make them less engaging, and I believe that bringing back multi-layered systems where direction, positioning, and spatial awareness matter more often could dramatically improve how combat feels. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate the support on my last video essay. Hitting 2,000 subs honestly means a lot, and it pushed me to be even more passionate about making this one. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you disagree, that's completely fine. I'd actually love to hear your perspective. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing, and thanks again for watching.